In the spring of 1994, a boy went behind his elementary school during recess and never came back. No alarm was raised right away. No one screamed. It wasn't that kind of moment. The bell rang. Kids ran to the buses. Teachers called out names. And behind room 3B, a silence began to take hold that wouldn't break for 30 years. When they found what had been buried under the roots beneath the classroom itself, it wasn't just about a missing child anymore. It was about a room that never should have existed, and a program no one was supposed to survive. Before we start, tap subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no child is ever forgotten. My name's Hannah Corbin. I'm 38 years old. I was born and raised in Tilden Creek, Ohio, small town. Good school's the kind of place where every yard had a flag and every Sunday smelled like somebody's cookout. Back then, we walked to school with our lunch boxes swinging at our sides. Parents waved from porches. If a kid scraped a knee, 5 teachers knew before the bell rang. Things felt solid, safe. I had a twin brother, Lucas. He and I weren't in the same class, but we saw each other every recess, every lunch. That year, 3rd grade, he was in room 3B. I was next door in 3A. We'd meet up by the tetherball pole before the bell race each other home. And for a long time, I remembered that spring as the season the honeysuckle came in early. The windows stayed open during tests, the smell drifted through chalk dust. That's what I remember. The smell, the sound of kids bouncing basketballs on cracked blacktop. And one boy who never made it back to class. His name was Ryan James. He was in Lucas's class. Not best friends, but close enough for playdates. Close enough to sit together at lunch. Close enough that when he vanished, Lucas didn't speak for 3 days. We were told not to talk about it. Not at home. Not at school. Our mom said it was too hard on your brother. The school sent a letter about counseling services and unfounded rumors. And just like that, the air got heavy in Tilden Creek. People moved on. At least that's what they looked like they were doing. I didn't. I kept remembering things that didn't make sense, like the way room 3B always felt too quiet after hours, or how Miss Braley, our teacher, closed the door fast if we lingered near it, or how once I saw the janitor disappear behind the portable classrooms with a set of keys and not come back out for almost an hour. That same spring, a fence had gone up along the back lot. They said it was for safety, but kids still knew the way through it. There was a spot where the links dipped low right behind room 3B where the woods got thicker. Ryan used to talk about it. The woods. They weren't part of the playground. We weren't supposed to go there. But every kid had dared someone at some point just to run in and touch the big tree. We all thought it was just childhood mischief. Then one afternoon Lucas came home quiet. Sat on the steps with his shoes still on. Didn't want dinner. Wouldn't tell me why. That night I heard him crying in his room. And the next morning, Ryan James didn't show up for school. I remember the day they dug up the stairwell. March 28th, 2024. The site behind room 3B was already a mess of tarps and churned up dirt. Construction crews had been prepping for a new stem wing clearing away the old portable classrooms when they hit something solid brick. At first, they thought it was part of an old septic tank. But when the foreman brushed away the last of the roots, what they found wasn't a tank. It was a sealed stairwell laid in tight red brick capped with mortar and buried just a few feet below the surface. Someone had gone to real effort to keep it hidden. That afternoon, they shut down the job site and called the police. I got the call the next morning. David Reese from the school board. He left a voicemail, said they'd uncovered something during the renovation that he thought I'd want to be informed. He didn't say Ryan's name, but I knew. The tone of his voice was enough. I hadn't heard that year spoken aloud in decades. By the time I pulled into the lot, the old school looked almost the same. Same peeling paint on the Tilden Creek Elementary sign, same cracked blacktop, same row of worn-out portables sagging under their own weight. It was like the past had just been left there waiting. The air smelled like wet leaves, and earth rain had passed through earlier that morning, and across the playground the tree line looked thinner than I remembered. More cleared out over the years, but still recognizable. Room 3B hadn't been used in decades. It was never replaced or reassigned, just locked up and left to weather. I slung my recorder bag over my shoulder and followed the caution tape around the perimeter. A man in a hard hat met me near the excavation pit. His name was Mitch Barlow, site lead. He asked if I was the podcaster they'd called in. I told him I'd volunteered. He didn't say much, just motioned me toward the hole. The air shifted the closer we got. Cooler, heavier. Not just from the depth. Something about that ground didn't want to be touched. The stairwell was narrow cut at a slight angle, framed by old tree roots that had grown down over the brick like fingers. Barlow said it had been sealed tight until a backhoe cracked the top during a dig. The inside had been damp quiet. They sent a team down to check for structural risk, and that's when they found the remains. 3 sets, one definitely a child. The other 2 adult male and female. One had a rusted ring of janitor keys still clipped to the belt loop. I didn't say anything right away. Just stood there looking down at the bricks, trying to feel something that I could name. That evening, I sat in the motel room with the recorder balanced in my lap. I started the first episode of what I hoped would just be a short update. Instead, I said, "This isn't just about a missing child. This is about what we bury, about what we build over the places we don't want to look." The next morning, the forensics team finished their initial sweep. They confirmed what we all suspected. Subject A, the child, matched Ryan James, age 9. Dental records and mitochondrial DNA confirmed it within hours. Subject B was Carl Dalen, the janitor. They got that from a partial dental record and the work-issued keys found on the body. The third, a woman older, unidentified, probably in her 50s. Early signs suggested arthritis old injuries, but no name yet. All 3 had been placed deliberately. The stairwell had been sealed from the outside. Not collapsed, not caved in, sealed, which meant none of them had any way out. Detective Noah Greer was assigned to the case. He'd grown up in Tilden Creek, too. Studied criminal justice back when Carl went missing. Said he always felt something was off about how fast that investigation had been shut down. No autopsy, no school-wide announcement, just a statement about a troubled man and a request for privacy. Now here he was, 30 years later, standing at the bottom of a hidden stairwell with 2 bodies and the boy everyone had tried to forget. What chilled me most wasn't the remains, it was what they found next. Beneath the crawl space under room 3B, just past a sheet of torn insulation, there was a reinforced wooden hatch. Floodlights showed scuff marks on the floor like someone had dragged something across it. Inside it opened into a narrow shaft, 6 feet long, barely 2 feet wide. Plywood walls, rubber mats, and a faint chemical smell that burned your throat. It led into a room. Small, boxy, concrete. At the center, a folding cot. Next to it, a plastic milk crate filled with juice boxes and old snack wrappers. And pinned across the far wall were drawings. Hundreds of them. Childlike, uneven, drawn in pencil and crayon. Stick figures, trees, the classroom, a girl with black hair, a boy with red shoes. And over the name Ryan scrawled in the corners, sometimes neat, sometimes shaking. And every one of them ended the same way, faces blacked out, eyes replaced with X's. Detective Greer crouched beside one and pointed at the edge. "It's signed," he said quietly. "But not by Ryan." I leaned in. In the lower right corner, the same name repeated across several pages. Not a child's name. Not one we recognized. Just 2 words, the keeper. That night, I uploaded a mini episode. I said Ryan wasn't taken far. He wasn't lost in the woods. He was here, underneath us, underneath them, steps away from his own classroom. And then I stopped recording because I didn't know what else to say. The next day, Greer met me outside the station. Said they'd run autopsies overnight. Carl Dalen hadn't died from a fall. His wrists showed healed ligature marks. His fingers had multiple fractures, some old, some recent. His ankle had been broken. Not suicide, Greer told me. Not even close. I asked if they were calling him the prime suspect. He said maybe. Or maybe he was another victim. Back at the historical library, I pulled yearbooks and staff records. Carl had been hired in 1986, no college degree, no prior employment listed. In the 1992 edition, there was another name, Irma Gates. Support educator, room 3B. No photo, just the listing. In 1993, she was gone. No resignation. No transfer. That evening, I drove to an address listed under the Gates name, an old stucco house at the end of Maple Run Lane. The man who answered the door looked to be in his 60s, said his name was Raymond. I asked if he was related to Irma. His face changed. He said she was my sister. I told him we believed her remains had been found behind the elementary school. He didn't flinch, said she'd vanished in 1995. They were told she'd moved. Got no answers. He invited me in. The house was still smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. He said Irma never married, didn't talk much about work, only said the school was a bad place, that she'd tried to quit twice, but Principal DeMarco convinced her to stay. I asked if she ever mentioned Ryan James. He shook his head, but then he paused. She did mention the janitor, he said he gave her the creeps, said he kept asking to borrow kids for side projects, that he had special plans for one of the boys. She'd reported him, twice, but the school board told her she was being paranoid. After that, they reassigned her, moved her out of room 3B. A week later, she disappeared. He opened a drawer and handed me a letter she'd sent him a month before that. Her handwriting was careful, but the words were sharp. There's something wrong with that classroom. I'm not crazy. I think they're hiding something in the walls. Carl's involved. I just don't know how deep it goes. I left his house with a copy of that letter, a date circled in red, and more weight in my chest than I'd had when I arrived. That night I sat on the motel floor with a stack of papers spread around me, names, file numbers, yearbook photos, and I started the next episode. I said 3 names, 3 bodies. Each disappeared in the spring of 1994. Only one was ever searched for. Irma tried to warn them. She tried. She told them something was wrong, and now they've all been found in the same grave. But I knew there was more. And whatever it was, it had been under our feet the whole time. I went back to the school district office the next morning. The building hadn't changed much since I was a kid. Same gray carpet, same posters about attendance and bus safety curling at the corners. A clerk named Melissa sat behind the front desk, mid-20s, maybe typing with one hand and holding a Red Bull in the other. I gave her my name, said I was looking for documents tied to portable room 3B, anywhere from 1989 to 1996. She raised an eyebrow and asked if I meant the murder room. I told her I just wanted the records. After a minute, she pointed to a back hallway and said the boxes were in a storage room nobody touched. Her exact words were, "If you find mold, don't tell me." The room smelled like dust and toner. Old fans hummed from the ceiling. I pulled 2 boxes labeled facilities and support logs and started from the bottom. At first, it was nothing useful, substitute teacher lists, cafeteria deliveries, field trip approval forms. But about halfway through the second box, I found a folder marked Incident Reports, Portable Classrooms. The paper was yellowed, the edges stuck together. Inside, there was a report filed April 29, 1994, 4 days before Ryan disappeared. It came from a teacher, Irma Gates. She'd noted recurrent student anxiety refusal to enter room 3B and disturbing behavior during rest periods. One child claimed to hear noises beneath the floor. She'd requested a site inspection. At the bottom, Principal DeMarco had signed off with a note, "No structural issue. Staff advised not to overreact." I flipped to the next sheet. It was a maintenance request dated April 15th, signed by Carl Dalen. Materials listed included 12 concrete pavers, 6 bags of mortar cinder blocks, waterproof sealant. Reason for request, subfloor ventilation rerouting. The approval box was stamped and signed DeMarco again. At the back of the folder, there was a single sheet of red cardstock, the kind used for confidential memos. Written in thick black marker across the top were the words, "Do not file." It was a typed memo from DeMarco to the Board of Education dated May 9th, 6 days after Ryan disappeared. It recommended the voluntary closure of room 3B due to trauma among staff and students. The final sentence read, "Further investigation not recommended." I photographed every page, packed up and left before the lights finished buzzing back on. That evening, I sat in my car outside the old school building. It was past 600 long after anyone had left the site. The chain-link fence still wrapped around the portables like crime tape. I stared at room 3B through the windshield, wondering how many people knew what had been happening and kept their heads down. The janitor ordered cement. A teacher filed a warning. A principal signed it all off. And the only one who got searched for was the boy who never came home. Later that night, I opened the last document I hadn't been ready to read. It was from the guidance office logbook for the 1993-94 school year. Staff list counseling notes. Scheduling blocks. But one entry stood out. Name Caroline Brooks. Title, Behavioral Specialist. Assigned to rooms 3B and 2C. Status terminated. May 4th. 1 day after Ryan vanished. Reason for termination. Voluntary resignation. Final paycheck unclaimed. Forwarding address none. That was the first night I dreamt about the room. Not the classroom. The one beneath it. Pink walls, crayon drawings, the mattress pressed against concrete. I saw a vent in the floor. A face on the other side whispering the name I hadn't said aloud since I was a child. The next morning I went to the town's public works department. The basement was stacked with blueprint tubes, old survey maps, building permits curled from moisture. I asked for anything tied to the portable classrooms, especially room 3B. A clerk helped me pull a roll dated August 1993. It listed the contractor R. Heller Construction, a small-time outfit that hadn't operated in years. There was a line item near the bottom tucked into the margins. Lower room, poured concrete slab, double-insulated panel. Not listed as a utility space, not described as a crawl space. Just lower room. It matched the timeline exactly. I tracked down the contractor later that afternoon. Raymond Heller. Retired now, living outside Mount Sterling in a ranch house with peeling shutters and a wooden sign that said, "No more jobs, but coffee's free." He answered the door wearing slippers and a fleece vest, blinked once when I asked about room 3B, then said I always wondered if they'd find that kid. We sat in his kitchen. He lit a pipe, let it sit in the ashtray. Said he was originally hired to reroute venting between portables. But sometime that summer, Carl Dalen pulled him aside and asked if he'd be willing to do some extra work. Nothing big, just carve out a chamber beneath one of the buildings. No permits. Paid in cash. Heller asked who authorized it. Carl said the principal had approved it personally. Heller said he didn't like it, but money was money. He opened a worn ledger from a drawer, flipped to a page marked September 93. It listed the job notes: lower room framed, reinforced slab, acoustic insulation added. Heller tapped the next line. Soundproofing panels placed along east wall. I asked why anyone would soundproof a crawlspace. He just shook his head. Said he'd ask the same thing. Carl told him kids get noisy. Later, he'd been called back to install a locking bolt, rewire the lighting, add a cot frame. Healer said he'd reported it once, called a building inspector. A week later, code enforcement showed up and told him to stay in his lane. He said it was the same man who paid him off the principal. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the motel bed with the ledger pages spread out in front of me. Thought about what it meant that Carl wasn't the only one down there. That maybe he didn't build it for himself. Maybe he built it because someone told him to. I uploaded episode 4 that night. Called it the Crawlspace Ledger. I told listeners that in 1993, a hidden room was built under room 3B. It had soundproof walls, a locking door, a cot, and a switchboard wired to an external breaker. A contractor built it off the books. A janitor requested it, and a principal signed off, but nobody ever asked why. The next morning, Detective Greer texted me. They'd found something at the base of the stairwell, something that hadn't been touched by dirt or time. I drove straight to the station. He didn't say what it was until I stepped into the evidence room. Then he showed me a photo. It was taken at the bottom of the stairs near the back wall of the sealed chamber. In the corner, sitting upright side by side, was a pair of small red sneakers. Velcro straps, white soles, and a faded lightning bolt logo near the heel. Size 2. He said they were untouched. No dirt on the treads, no signs of decay. Preserved as if they'd been wrapped and kept safe, not buried with Ryan. Placed there, like someone wanted them to be found. I stared at the photo and didn't say anything. Not for a while. Then I said the only thing that made sense. They were never meant to be lost. Greer nodded. Or maybe they were. Until now. And that was when it started to shift. When the case stopped being about what happened under room 3B and became about who wanted it remembered. I sat in the motel parking lot long after dark engine off the dashboard still warm under my hand. The red sneakers were all I could think about. Not just the fact that they were clean, but too clean. They hadn't touched dirt in decades. There wasn't a grain of soil in the treads, not even a scuff across the toes. And it wasn't just me seeing it. Forensics confirmed it. No degradation, no insect damage, no evidence of long-term exposure. It was like they'd been kept in storage in controlled air. But who stored them? And why bring them back now? It didn't make sense unless someone wanted them seen, unless this was meant to start something, not end it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept playing the old footage over and over, the one I pulled from the district's archived safety videos digitized from a 1993 VHS. You could see Ryan in the corner of the frame following the other kids outside during a fire drill. Messy brown hair, one pant leg caught in the top of his boot. And the shoes. Same color. Same style. The right Velcro strap curling at the edge. Those were the shoes. He wore them the day he disappeared. And yet they weren't found with his body. They were sitting outside the sealed room, untouched, like someone had returned them to the scene. The next morning, I was halfway through my coffee when a message came through the podcast inbox. The subject line just read, "I know what the red shoes mean." The sender was Jamie Clyde. I hadn't heard that name in 30 years. He was quiet in school, always off to the side during recess, standing just outside the circle of any game. I remembered him mostly from lunch duty. Skinny kid always brought a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. His message was short. Said he saw the shoes back then behind the portables. Said he told the counselor. But she told him he was dreaming. Then he wrote, "I'm ready to talk." He gave an address in West Tilden Creek, an apartment complex I hadn't been to since high school. I parked near a unit with dead potted plants on the balcony and a fish tank in the window with no fish in it. Jamie answered the door wearing a thermal shirt sleeves pulled over chewed-up fingernails. He looked older than 38. Pale, twitchy eyes that wouldn't quite settle. But when he saw me, something flickered in his face. Recognition, maybe, or maybe just the weight of time. "You're Corbin's sister," he said. I nodded. "I was in 3A, he said. "Everyone remembers Lucas." He stepped aside, let me in. The apartment smelled like old wood and something sharp, maybe lemon cleaner. He sat in a chair that sagged under his frame, hands clasped between his knees. I asked him what he remembered about the day Ryan disappeared. He said he'd never told anyone the real version, only what he was supposed to say. He told me he'd been in the nurse's office that morning. Stomach problems. They used to let him lie down after breakfast for 30 minutes. He remembered the time because the nurse always listened to the same station light rock local ads. That day they played Kiss from a Rose, and he said it was the first time he ever heard it. While he was lying on the cot, blinds half open, he saw something through the window. The nurse's office faced the back field, and if the blinds were tilted just right, you could see the space between portables. "I saw someone dragging a kid," he said, "by the arms, limp like a doll, behind room 3B. I asked if it was Ryan. He nodded without hesitation. Said he saw the shoes. One fell off. The person picked it up and shoved it in a pocket. It wasn't the janitor, he said. It wasn't Carl. I asked who it was. He swallowed, stared at the floor. I think it was Miss Brooks. The air in the room changed. He looked at me, eyes wet but steady. The guidance counselor, he said. She used to come into our room on Thursdays, sometimes Tuesdays. She'd sit in the back with a black notebook. She never smiled right, like it was a thing she'd been taught how to do. Are you sure it was her? I asked. He nodded slowly. I saw her face. The next day they said she transferred, but no one ever said where. That night I pulled the yearbooks again. 1992, 1993. There she was, Caroline Brooks, guidance counselor. Sharp features, chin-length brown hair, tight-lipped smile. Personnel files confirmed she resigned May 4th. No forwarding address. Final check unclaimed. Just like Irma. I ran her name through every state license board in the region. Nothing current. Nothing active. But when I ran an alias search, flipped the names, dropped the middle initial, I got a hit. Brooke C. Ames, former licensed social worker. Revoked in 2008, Chicago. Reason listed as professional misconduct involving minors. The photo on the disciplinary record matched. It was her. Later that night, I recorded episode 6. I didn't dress it up. I didn't speculate. I just said the facts. That Ryan wasn't dragged into the woods. He was seen by a child in the arms of someone meant to protect him. That Caroline Brooks left the district the day after he vanished. That she later reappeared under a different name in a different state and lost her license under a sealed complaint. I said her name because no one else had. The next morning, I drove back to the school site. The stairwell was sealed again, covered with reinforced tarp and concrete barriers. But something about the ground didn't sit right. The forensic team had been tapping along the southern wall with survey rods. One section sounded different, hollow. By early afternoon, they broke through the false brick. Behind it was a second stairwell, narrower, steeper. The air down there was still cold and sharp, not like a basement, more like a vault. And at the bottom, another room. No drywall, no paint. Just rough poured concrete about 7 feet deep. A warped wooden desk. 3 black notebooks in a sealed bag. A child-sized chair bolted to the floor. And on the wall carved by hand names. Some full, some just initials, some unfinished, and one etched deeper than the rest PR01. Greer stood beside me in silence. He didn't need to say it. We both knew what that meant. They'd built more than one room, and whoever had started this hadn't planned to stop. The notebooks from the second chamber were sealed in plastic and stored in an evidence locker, but Greer had them scanned. I went through them one page at a time at the precinct, sitting in a silent conference room with a stack of black and white printouts that still smelled faintly of ink. The handwriting was precise, tight loops, careful spacing, no hesitation. Whoever wrote them had done it for an audience. 3 notebooks each labeled by hand in the top corner, PR01. Inside were diagrams, session logs, behavioral assessments. Nothing that sounded like a school. Everything that read like an experiment. The first pages outlined a structure clearly mapped, clearly built. Portable 3B wasn't a repurposed classroom. It was a test site. The language was clean and clinical. Subject isolation begins at entry. Reinforcement by repetition, control by environmental shift. Incentives issued at 24-hour intervals. Noise discipline applied during resistance. In one margin, a name appeared again and again. C. Brooks. Another note, written smaller, said, "Advised by A. DeMarco." That part hadn't shown up in any district file. By the middle of the first notebook, I found an entry labeled only by date March 31st, 1994. Subject RJ demonstrated sustained compliance after third isolated session. Initial resistance followed by rapid adjustment. Memory displacement consistent with projected outcome. Obedience conditioned by routine and praise. Stronger reaction to auditory cues than visual. Underneath that was a scribbled line as if someone had started a thought and backed off. The second notebook was worse. Longer entries, more detail. It logged a second subject, just the initial L. That hit hard. There hadn't been many L names in my grade that year, and only one child who spent any time inside 3B who also didn't come home speaking much for weeks afterward. My brother Lucas. I flipped through until I found his initials again, subject L. Showed pattern of resistance. High recall retention, low responsiveness to reward. Session length extended. Result subject returned to classroom after termination of test. That phrase, "returned to classroom," sat like a stone in my throat. They didn't just take children. They sent some back. Greer stood across from me when I told him. He didn't say much, just handed me a stapled report from the excavation site. They'd found more names in the concrete wall, names carved so faintly they didn't show up until they angled light across the surface. Victoria, Tanya, a few initials, LC, RJ, CB. One of them hadn't been finished. Just a shallow LU, the rest worn smooth. I stared at it for a long time. When we were kids, Lucas used to carve his name into things. Trees, fences, the edge of his desk. He always stopped at the U, said he didn't like the way the C looked after it. Said it felt like it was leaning. I remembered that while looking at the wall, standing in that cold, hollow space, no child should have been near. I left the site just after dusk and drove to the Historical Archive Center. I needed to see if there were other mentions of this project room, if it had ever shown up on a board agenda, a facilities update, anything that might explain why no one had stopped it. I found nothing official. No meeting minutes, no budget line items. But there was one folder that had been misfiled under transportation maintenance. It held a map of the portable units as they were arranged in 1994. On the back, faint pencil marks outlined proposed expansions. One of them was labeled PR02. A note beside it said pending fall 1995 secondary wing. That meant they planned more, that what happened in room 3B was only meant to be the beginning. I recorded the next episode that night. Sat in my rental car outside the school, the windows fogging from my breath. I kept my voice steady. Didn't rush. I told them about the chair bolted to the floor, the notebooks, the initials carved into concrete. I read a few of the lines exactly as they appeared about obedience, about environmental manipulation, about children who had been brought in, broken down, then sent back like nothing had happened. I said one of those children might have been my brother. And I said I didn't know what that meant for him or for the others. The next morning, I got a message from someone who wouldn't give her name. The email said only I was in room 3B in 93. I remember the lower room. I didn't die there. I got out. I asked for proof. She said I don't have any, but I remember Ryan. She said she'd talk, but only in person, only off record. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a hotel just outside Columbus. She called herself Wren. That wasn't her real name, but I didn't press. She looked about my age. Her hands trembled when she lit a cigarette. The room smelled like laundry detergent and stale coffee, and she hadn't pulled the curtains open. She started slowly. Said she was always pulled from class, told she needed quiet time. The counselor would walk her out back behind room 3B. Said there was a hatch under the building. The first few times she was only there for a few minutes, then longer, then overnight. Said the room had a mattress, a tape player, that they played the same story over and over again about a house with no doors. If she didn't repeat it word for word, she'd have to start again. She said sometimes there were lights, sometimes there weren't, sometimes food, sometimes nothing. I asked her who else was there. She said, a boy, small, quiet. I think it was Ryan. She said he told her when to be quiet, when not to cry, that he already knew the rules. She said he helped her once when she couldn't stop shaking, pulled his blanket over her and whispered, "Don't make a sound." Then one day he was gone. She said the counselor came back alone, told her she was a good listener, said she had potential. A week later, during a fire drill, Wren slipped out, ran barefoot to the end of the street. A woman in a maroon station wagon picked her up and dropped her at the ER. She lied to the nurses, told them she'd run away from home. They didn't ask more. I asked her why she came forward now. She reached into her bag and pulled out a printout of my podcast episode list, tapped the one called "The Foundation Wasn't Stable." She said, "You read the names on the wall. I remember one of them. Tanya." She carved her name into the bed frame. I think they wanted the kids who didn't fight. Then she paused. Ryan didn't fight. That's why they chose him. He was the first one they didn't bring back. I didn't ask anything after that. I just let the silence settle. Later that night, back in the motel, I sat with the recorder in my lap. I didn't script this one. I just pressed record. I said, "Her name isn't Wren, but her story's real. She remembers the pink walls, the mattress, the stories on tape. She remembers the voice that told her she was next. And she remembers Ryan. Not as a headline. As a boy. A quiet boy who helped her survive." I ended the recording with a sentence I hadn't planned. I said, "He gave up his chance to run so someone else could make it out." Then I shut it off and stared at the wall for a long time, because deep down I knew we hadn't reached the bottom yet. The hotel room stayed dark even after sunrise. I hadn't slept. I kept going back to what Wren said about Ryan, about the mattress, about the voice that told her she was next. It wasn't just her memory that stuck. It was the way she said it, like it had been waiting at the edge of her breath for 30 years. I played the recording back twice, not for what she said, but for the silence between her words. The kind that doesn't come from imagination. It comes from memory that's too heavy to hold any other way. And I kept wondering what would have happened if she hadn't run, if the fire drill hadn't lined up just right. If she hadn't taken that single moment to run barefoot across a field and flag down a stranger. The field behind the old school was still overgrown. Weeds up past the knees fence rusted through at the bottom. Greer had the new site locked down, but he let me in under supervision. The second chamber was fully cleared. The concrete walls had been marked, measured, and scanned, but they hadn't breached the southern side yet. That section had been oddly reinforced, older concrete layered over what they believed might be a third stairwell. No guarantees, just a shift in density, a pressure void. But my gut said there was more. I stood near the wall and closed my eyes, not to feel anything, just to listen. I'd learned something doing this work, how to tell when a space doesn't echo right. That afternoon, I drove 2 hours south to meet someone who claimed he knew where DeMarco had gone. Not the full name, just the one that appeared in the margins of the notebooks. Wren hadn't recognized it. Greer said there was no employee under that name on the payroll during our school years. But a message came through from a man named Thomas Hadley. He said he used to do HVAC installs for the district. Claimed he remembered a man dark suit always came during off hours, sometimes parked behind the school near the staff dumpsters. He was never alone. Always had a clipboard, always left before the bell. When I asked if he knew the name, Hadley said, "Not at first." But I remember the label on the boxes he brought. PRDMK. They were stenciled like military equipment. He gave me an address, an old warehouse on the edge of Selden Park. Said it used to be leased by a private contractor. Claimed it was tied to an educational research group out of Indianapolis. I checked the lease history. The company name was scrubbed, but the paperwork had a receiver listed AD Logistics. The initials matched. The record stopped in 1997. That's the same year the portables at Tilden Creek were quietly dismantled and sold for scrap. No media notice, no district memo, just gone. The warehouse itself had been boarded up, but the rear access door had rotted at the base. Greer wasn't with me this time. I didn't ask permission. I just stepped inside. The smell hit first dry paper mold and something electrical like burnt plastic. Light came through a broken vent near the ceiling. The space was larger than I expected. Rows of cabinets, a few collapsed shelves. No signs of people recently, but traces of what had once been an office. Loose files, rusted light fixtures, one desk still standing, bolted to the floor. On the wall above it, an old dry erase board had a faint grid sketched across it. 6 rows, each labeled PR01 through PR06. Next to them were first names, some crossed out, some circled. One of the names was Tanya. Another was Lucas. My stomach tightened when I saw it. Just a name. But seeing it there on a board in a forgotten warehouse did something to me I wasn't ready for. Inside one of the file drawers, I found a metal tin sealed with duct tape. Took me 15 minutes to get it open without tearing the label. Inside was a cassette. No markings, just the number 03 written in blue ink. The recorder was still on the shelf above the desk. Old dusty, but the batteries hadn't corroded. I pressed play. It was a child's voice. Young. Not crying, not panicked, just repeating phrases. The same story Wren mentioned. About the house with no doors. The voice would stop, then a beep would follow. Then an adult voice would repeat the line back calm, even slightly distorted. Then the child would say it again. It looped for nearly 10 minutes. And then, at the end, there was a silence, followed by the same adult voice saying, "Subject PR03 retention incomplete. Begin correction." I shut it off, put the tape in a padded envelope, and locked it in my trunk. I didn't go straight back to the motel. I drove to the county assessor's office. I needed property records, specifically anything tied to AD Logistics between 1992 and 1997. Most were dead leads. But one record stood out. A shipping container purchased in '95 listed as instructional storage. The coordinates put it less than 5 miles from where the bus route turned off in early spring of '94. A wooded area that had once been used as a gravel pit, then left to overgrow. I drove out the next morning with a park map and a pair of boots I hadn't worn since college. It took over an hour of walking before I found it partially sunken, overgrown with vine, but still sealed at the doors. No padlock, just rusted hinges and a warped bar that came loose with enough pressure. The air inside was stale, dust thick enough to leave trails behind my steps. And in the center, covered by a canvas tarp, was something I recognized immediately. A chair. Small. Fixed to the floor. Beside it a tape player. A stack of labeled cassettes. And pinned to the far wall a list. Handwritten. 7 names. One of them was Ryan. The last 2 were blank. I stood there for a long time, just reading, memorizing the shape of each name, knowing there were more places like this, that the second chamber wasn't the end. It was a middle, and there were still blanks waiting to be filled. The names on the wall weren't just markers. They were a sequence. 7 written in a child's hand, 5 with full names, 2 with blanks. One of those blanks was marked with a pencil tick. Someone had been keeping count. It hadn't been random. These weren't kids who wandered off and happened to end up inside that room. They were selected, moved, logged. Ryan's name was the third one listed. I couldn't stop looking at it, the way the R dipped just slightly lower than the Y. The loop in the A like it had been traced twice. I knew that kind of writing. Not his, exactly, but the kind of careful shape a child makes when someone's watching. That container wasn't just a backup site. It was a waiting room, for the ones who hadn't responded to the first round, or maybe for those who did. And that was the problem. I brought everything back to Greer's office and laid it out on the table. He didn't say much at first, just kept flipping the pages, looking between the cassette labels and the list from the warehouse. Eventually, he reached for the report from the concrete wall, the one with the faint initials found in the second chamber. One of the forensics guys had enhanced a carving RJ scratched low, almost floor level, like it had been done under the chair. We hadn't noticed the full detail until then. Just under the initials, barely visible, was a number 03. Greer placed that next to the tape labeled 03 from the warehouse. He looked at me and said, "I think that's your match." The voice on the tape, the one repeating the story about the house with no doors, wasn't just a training exercise. It was a record, a confirmation. Ryan James had been PR-03. That was the moment I stopped calling it a school experiment. This wasn't behavioral testing. It wasn't even about education. It was conditioning. Repetitive stimulus confined space, language reinforcement obedience through isolation. They'd built a compliance chamber, dressed it up with carpeting and child-safe materials, and then buried it under a public elementary school. I kept asking myself how many people knew. Not the teachers, not the janitors, not the parents. But someone had to sign off on the permits. Someone had to authorize the construction, and someone had to keep the names off the record. That night, I went back through the footage from the dig site, frame by frame, at timestamp 1:42:09. During the partial collapse of the eastern wall, there was a flicker, what looked like insulation, then a void, then what I thought was a box. But when the dust settled, it was something else. A monitor. Old. CRT. Covered in a tarp that had mostly disintegrated. When the team removed it, they found it wired to a junction box, which had been fried probably decades ago. But the monitor itself had a label. PRSUPV. I asked what that meant. No one knew, but it was clearly part of the room. Mounted for observation. Not for the kids, for whoever was watching them. The casing had melted in one corner, but the base had a memory port. We didn't expect it to hold anything. It was too old. But Greer had a tech-run diagnostics. Took 2 days. On the 3rd, I got a call. They'd recovered fragments from the system. Partial video, low resolution, no audio. But enough. It showed the inside of the chamber from above. A wide-angle lens, slightly distorted, focused on the chair. Kids came and went, always alone. One session ran 8 hours. One of the clips, time-stamped April 3rd, 1994, showed a child sitting motionless, arms at his sides, not blinking, just staring forward. A man stepped into frame, briefly adjusted something on the desk, then stepped back out. That was the only time an adult ever entered the shot. I watched that footage at the station. They let me sit alone. I leaned forward, paused, rewound, played it again. I couldn't say for certain it was Ryan. but the build matched. The hair, the stillness, the way he held himself like he was waiting for something, like he already knew what came next. That kind of stillness only comes from repetition. He wasn't scared anymore. He was trained. The system tagged every clip with a session number. The last one, session 37, had no exit footage. The child entered, sat down, then nothing. The tape cut out. No record of him leaving. No adult. No follow-up. Just black. That was the last footage logged before the system shut down. I called Wren later that night and told her what we'd found. I didn't give details, just said that Ryan had made it into the chamber, that we had evidence now. She didn't say much back. Just asked one question. Was there ever a session 38? I told her no. The system ended there. A week later, an envelope showed up at Greer's precinct. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed a concrete room, a chair, and a child sitting with his back to the camera. The timestamp in the corner was handwritten April 4th, 1994. That would have been the day after session 37. On the back of the photo was a name, DeMarco. Nothing else. No explanation. Just a name. We ran forensics. No fingerprints. No traceable origin. But it meant someone still had access. Someone had kept a copy. Someone had waited all this time to send it. That was when it hit me. Whoever ran this program didn't bury it because it failed. They buried it because it worked. They got what they wanted, and then they disappeared. And now, 30 years later, the names were starting to come back up. But the people who put them there hadn't disappeared. They were still watching. And I wasn't done digging. The day the photo came in, Greer filed an official request for federal assistance. Not because he thought the Bureau would act quickly, he knew they wouldn't, but because it gave us legal grounds to reopen the sealed site under a broader scope. We weren't just dealing with an abandoned school anymore. We had evidence of unlawful detainment, possibly human testing, and at least one minor who vanished while in district custody. The moment that photo arrived with DeMarco handwritten on the back, it changed the conversation. It gave the case a name, one that hadn't shown up in any personnel file badge list or vendor contract. And that told us something even more disturbing. DeMarco had been protected, not hidden protected, which meant the system didn't break down. It was never meant to be transparent in the first place. We started getting calls from former staff custodians, aides, supply drivers, people who had been in and out of Tilden Creek between 93 and 95. Most didn't remember much, but one man, a retired groundskeeper named Vernon Hale, told us something that stuck. He said during the final year before the school shut down, certain parts of the West Wing were labeled off-limits even to maintenance. There were signs on the doors, plain white sheets with the letters PR Unit printed in black. When Hale asked about them, the assistant principal told him it was part of a literacy initiative through the state. He didn't question it at the time, but he remembered the locks being changed mid-year and deliveries coming in unmarked. That gave us enough to get a second warrant, this one covering the portable unit storage site 30 miles north. Most of the portables had been demolished in the late 90s, but 2 had been relocated to a private lot near a rural training center. They were owned by a defunct company that used to rent mobile classrooms to correctional facilities. We found the listing buried under a transfer agreement signed by a shell company. The paperwork was a mess. Partial addresses, outdated phone numbers, missing signatures. But the serial tags matched. One of those portables had come from Tilden Creek. The lot was surrounded by pine scrub and old barbed wire. When we got there, the portable looked untouched. The ramp was caved in, and the outer panels were weathered, but the interior was dry. Someone had sealed it well. Inside, the layout was different than a classroom. It had no desks, no chalkboard, no shelving. Just 2 booths partitioned, wired with switches and dials that were completely disconnected, and a small closet with what looked like a sound system mounted to the wall. Beneath the floorboards, in a narrow cavity barely 8 inches deep, we found a stack of folders, all water-damaged, some unreadable, but a few were still intact. Each one had a name, a date, and a series of behavioral entries, PR01 through PR06. Each page was marked Session Log with codes next to categories like Response Latency, Resistance, Story, Coherence, and Correction Applied. We brought them back for forensic imaging, and that's when I saw it. On the third page of Ryan's folder, next to Resistance Level and Correction Outcome, was a scribbled note. It said, "Sustained auditory fixation. He walks behind the door." That was the phrase. The one Wren mentioned. The one Ryan had whispered the night before he vanished. The same story. Same shape. Like it had been passed from one child to the next, planted and reinforced until it became reflex. And there in black ink was the system that measured it, graded it, decided whether it was good enough. By now, the case had started to move. Quietly. We weren't on the news. There were no press releases. But state investigators came in under the radar. They took over jurisdiction of the site and froze all remaining files. I was kept on in a consult role, but I knew what that meant. They were moving toward containment, not justice. They wanted to classify, not charge. They said it was about the integrity of the case, but I'd seen that play out before. What they really meant was, we're not prepared for what happens if this becomes public. Wren and I met for coffee the day after the handoff. It was the first time I'd seen her without the recorder running. She looked older than I remembered, like something in her had finally settled, but not in a peaceful way. More like exhaustion with no off switch. I told her what we found. Not everything, but enough. The folders, the audio logs, the possibility that Ryan's voice had been captured in session 37. She didn't ask for copies. She didn't cry. She just stared out the window and said, "They said he was disruptive. That's what the teacher wrote in the note. Disruptive in unstructured settings." Like he was a malfunction. She reached into her bag and pulled out something I hadn't seen before, a small notebook, spiral-bound. The kind kids used to keep lists or doodles. She said it was found in a storage box after her parents died, tucked inside the back cover of Ryan's storybooks. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange phrases, repetitions, fragments of the same story about the house with no doors, but something else too. One phrase written over and over in crooked, slanted lines. DeMarco stands still. The door moves. That night I called Greer. Told him we needed to cross-check the name again, not just in payroll, but in transport logs. Supply vendors, contractor payouts, anything that touched school infrastructure between 1992 and 1996. It took 3 days, but we found it. A payment stub tied to a delivery manifest under an internal code, PR/LOG-DM. The delivery was marked for Unit 3. The items included soundproof wall panels, tethered seating units, and 4 motion-triggered lighting sensors, all shipped from a company based in Indianapolis, the same city the warehouse lease traced back to. We had our link, but no living person attached to the name. The next morning, Greer got a call. Anonymous tip. A woman said she worked night shift cleaning office buildings in the late 90s. Said one of the properties near Monroe Industrial Park had a lower level no one was allowed to enter. But sometimes she'd hear things static, murmuring like voices coming through speakers that weren't turned on. The building had been torn down in 2002, but we tracked the old land use records. And there it was again. The permit listed under a temporary development title, DMK Research Solutions. 8 months after the second chamber was uncovered, the site was sealed. All entries were recorded, all visitors logged, but that didn't stop the messages. At least once a month someone sent an envelope. Always the same format, no return address, local postmark, plain white card inside. On each one a name from the original list. Sometimes with a new date, sometimes crossed out, but never random. They came in order. The last card came on a Tuesday. It had one word on it. return. And below it, in small printed letters, PR03, final session. There was no stamp, no tracking, just the message and a date. It was the same day the school was scheduled for demolition. They demolished the school at dawn. I watched from the access road parked just beyond the orange barrier engine off windows down. The air was cold and still. No crowd, no news vans. Just a handful of county workers and a rented excavator moving slow through the fog. I didn't take photos. Didn't write anything down. I just stood there and listened, waiting to hear something I couldn't explain. But nothing came. No voices. No echoes. Just the sound of concrete splitting and metal crumpling under its own weight. It should have felt like an ending, but it didn't. That was 2 years ago. The site is a gravel lot now. Fenced in, locked, barely marked. There's no plaque, no sign. Most people who drive past don't even know what used to be there. That's by design. The state reclassified the records under archival seal, citing safety and public trust. What little we were able to keep photos, logs, evidence tags, they sit in a private case file, not admissible in court. But that was never the point. The truth isn't always something you can prosecute. Sometimes it just has to be carried, held by the people who remember it, so it doesn't happen again. Wren moved out of state not long after the last card came. She never filed a formal complaint, never made a statement, but she left a copy of Ryan's notebook with me, said she didn't want to bring it with her. I keep it in a locked drawer away from the others. It's not official evidence. It never was. But it's the most honest record we have. Page after page of a child trying to map something no one would believe, drawing what he saw because no one would listen to what he heard. That's what stays with me. Not the horror, the silence. As for DeMarco, whoever or whatever that name belonged to, we never found them. No photo, no voice sample, no confirmed alias, just patterns, funding streams, rental contracts with signatures that didn't match. You start to see the shape of something even if you can't draw the edges. I believe they used the school as a test site. I believe they built something into those children's minds, something meant to be erased or replaced. But memory doesn't work like that. You can't overwrite a story once it's been lived. You can only bury it and hope it stays buried. But it didn't, because the children remembered. Not all of them survived. Some were never found. Some left no trace. But the ones who made it out, they carried pieces. In dreams, in notebooks, in quiet flickering flashes they couldn't put words to. I think that's what the program failed to understand. That you can break a body. You can even break a mind. But story, real story, gets passed down whether you want it to or not. And eventually it gets told. I still keep in touch with Greer. He's retired now, bought a place in the mountains. Says he doesn't miss the job, but he never stopped tracking the names. Every now and then one will pop up in a missing persons alert, usually nothing. But we still check, just in case. People ask sometimes why I keep going back to the files, why I keep reading Ryan's name, Wren's letters, session logs we can't verify. And the truth is, I don't know. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's the weight of seeing something you can't unsee. Or maybe it's just this someone has to remember. Someone has to say the names out loud. Because once they're gone, it's not just the story that disappears. It's the warning. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Not for clicks, not for closure, but so no name gets left behind. So no child's voice goes unheard again.